Tom, now let's take a look at a big story of the week. And that big story is the death of computing pioneer and Intel co founder Gordon Moore. His name is commonly used in reference to Moore's Law, which stated that processors would become exponentially more complex and thus exponentially better every year and then every 2 years, from the 1960s to the 70s to today. And we hear quite a lot about Moore's Law, but many people might not be really aware of the person behind that term. Moore was a visionary. He guided Intel from the founding of the company in the 1960s through the DRAM market in the 1970s, and then the transition into the microprocessors in microcomputers in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s. He was the CEO of the company. He led the company for 30 years. He was quiet, he was polite, he was humble, he was not brash, unlike Robert Noyce and Andy Grove, the other parts of the Intel trio in the early years. But everyone trusted Moore. They knew that his thoughtful and considered decisions could be relied upon, and they went with them, and it proved decisive in leading Intel to the dominant position that it had in the 90s when he finally retired. Moore learned from his mistakes. He notably, as I wrote on my blog, had a foray into the digital watch market that did not pan out in the 1970s. And to remind him of that mistake, he actually wore that watch for decades to remind himself of his own failings. He was able to lead while having others have their own autonomy. And he famously led by asking questions and listening and leading people to their own decisions. In a way, Moore created Silicon Valley, but it was entirely unlike what it has become. We could surely use more leaders in the mold of Gordon Moore.
Yeah, Stephen, I couldn't agree more. When you look at some of the pieces that have been written about him in the last week since we learned of his passing, a lot of people, almost universally, he's well liked. He's very, he's knowledgeable. One of the things that in the Intel piece that we linked in the show notes they talked about was the fact that, there are people who have the power of being the manager, the person in charge. And then there are people who have the power of being knowledgeable and smart about it. And everyone universally says that Gordon Moore had the knowledge, power. People wanted to talk to him. People didn't listen to him because he had the CEO title. They listened to him because he was Gordon Moore, because he was smart, because he understood the technology. I mean, we talk even today about whether or not Moore's Law is still relevant. And how many things can you think of that we've talked about in the last 40 years that are still relevant? 640K is enough memory for people. Apple shouldn't make phones. Like, think of all the technology predictions that you know of that have gone catastrophically the other direction. And then we're still talking about what Moore's Law means. But more importantly to me is when you look at the way he comported himself as a person, like look at the number of stories that involve, he just kind of unassumingly went to work each day. He drove the same car forever. Like, think of all of the I don't know, the pageantry that goes along with being in Silicon Valley now. Hey, we just hit our IPO. I need to go buy an expensive new sports car. Hey, did you understand that I'm the CEO because I'm the one wearing the really fancy suits and I'm going to come to work at 10 a.m. every day and I'm going to do all this other stuff? That's not the kind of person that Gordon Moore was. He worked. He did the job. He learned. He learned by making mistakes. How many people in the executive branch would admit they made a mistake, let alone, as you said, wear that mistake on their wrist every day as a reminder to themselves of what they did? I mean, I personally believe, even though I've never met the man, I personally believe he's the kind of person that I would want to talk to, that I would want to learn from, that I would want to understand, because the power that you have by being in charge of a thing is fleeting, because one day you might not be in charge. But the power that you have by being the most intelligent person around sticks with you no matter what.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better, Tom. I mean, I didn't meet the man personally, but the things that I'm hearing from people who did know him are just remarkable. He sat in a cube at Intel. They said that his cube was a little nicer, but he wasn't the kind of person who needed to stand in front. He was the kind of person who led from the back. One of the things that is the most remarkable, though, is that for all his soft-spokenness and respectfulness and quietness, he was absolutely in charge of so many things. So Moore was the one who led the so-called traitorous eight out of Shockley Semiconductor and led to the foundation of Fairchild Semiconductor. Of the eight really big brains, PhDs and business leaders and future venture capitalists and bankers and all that, if you look at the history of the traitorous eight, it is remarkable to think that it was Gordon Moore, of all those people, who led that group to split with Shockley. And I think that one of the reasons they did was because Shockley was the exact opposite of Gordon Moore. And so by doing that, by establishing Fairchild, Intel essentially, or Gordon Moore essentially established Silicon Valley and moved the focus of semiconductor production from the East, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, to California. After that, it was Moore and Noyce that founded what they called at the time NM Electronics, Noyce Moore Electronics, or as some people have suggested, MN Electronics. But Moore was the kind of person who would let his name be mentioned second. He was famously embarrassed of Moore's Law. He didn't call it that. Carver Mead of Caltech called it that, and he didn't like to think about it, that he had this famous thing named after him. As I said, at Intel, one of the first things that they did was see an opening in the market for DRAM. And many people today might not know that Intel, for the first decade of its existence, was essentially a DRAM company that also dabbled in other types of semiconductors. I want to talk a little bit about Intel's foray into the digital watch market, not because I love watches, which I do, but because it's very illuminating not only about Gordon Moore and Intel, but about the entire IT industry and the products that we look at today. So in the 1970s, while there was the transition going on to digital and quartz watches from mechanical watches, one of the things that enabled that transition was semiconductors, ICs. In fact, one of the other traitorous eight members, a Swiss scientist by the name of Horney, was able to bring that technology back to Switzerland and make it possible for us to have digital watches and quartz watches and all those things, because they needed low-powered, high-performance counters. Well, Intel basically went in the opposite direction as Horney's Intercell company went, and basically these companies were sort of on parallel tracks. We had Intercell, which you could think of as sort of like an ARM, in that they were focused on low-power, portable, special-purpose processors, while Intel was focused on memory, DRAM, and also more complex and general-purpose processors that they're famous for. Moore actually refused to give Horney any credit for any of the things that he had brought to Fairchild, and I think that caused a split between the two. But Moore was smart enough to see that Intersil, this rival, this offshoot, was actually onto something, and that had created a new market for, yes, portable devices. And so Moore bought a Silicon Valley startup called Microma that was working on portable processors. More to the point, Microma was interested in integrating all of the features and creating something called a system on a chip. If that rings a bell, that's because that's how every mobile device is today. But Microma was pioneering this in 1972, and Moore saw that opportunity, bought the company, and basically established an SoC, a mobile SoC company within Intel. This is the kind of person this was. He saw an opportunity. It made sense to him. He saw that that somebody else's idea was a better idea, and he moved into it. It ended up being a colossal failure, though, because essentially Intel didn't just decide to make the system on a chip. They decided to make watches. They decided to sell them at retail. You could go to a Sears store and buy an Intel watch. They hired one of the guys from MASH to make an expensive TV commercial for this thing. It was a giant failure. And so Intel, and again, to his credit, Moore realized how much of a failure it was. I think Andy Grove had a part in that as well. And Moore said, you know what, we're going to get out of this business. They sold it back to the Swiss. They walked away. And as I said, Moore famously wore what he called my $15 million watch for decades to remind himself of his failure. But the truth is, as we see today with smartwatches and phones and all these portable devices, the system on a chip concept, the low powered processor concept, the integration concept was absolutely right. That's the ironic thing. Moore's greatest mistake was actually right. The wrong part was getting into consumer products. That was the mistake that Intel made. And so if you look again, you see this as a person who was willing to see an opportunity, to try to do the best they could, and then to move away when it wasn't working. He did the same thing with the RAM market. Famously, he analyzed the thing. I mean, this was a huge deal for Intel. This was their entire reason for existence. I mean, could you imagine, I don't know, Ford getting out of manufacturing cars? It was like that. But Moore looked at the evidence, he looked at the market, he looked at what the Japanese competitors were doing, what other companies were doing in the RAM market, and he said, this is just not a good market for us. We're leaving this market and we're going to focus on microprocessors. And everybody was aghast, but of course, because he was Gordon Moore, and he had done the analysis, he had done the research, he knew what he was doing, he was able to lead the company out of that market quietly, gently, efficiently, and the company just took off in a different market. And that's really who we are. And that's why I said at the top, I really wish that there were more leaders like Gordon Moore who could look at things objectively, he could look at markets, who would look at opportunities, and could see, basically what was an opportunity for a product that could sell, that would have volume. I think too often now we're focused too much on numbers and on investments and on buyouts and all these what's your exit strategy? I bet Gordon Moore never had an exit strategy for Intel. His exit strategy was to make this thing huge and successful and to sell lots of stuff at a profit. I think we need more leaders like that and less leaders, frankly, like some of the other folks from Intel and from everybody else who are out there, pounding their chests and talking about how great they are. Let's prove it. Let's prove how great you are by quietly producing great products.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Stephen. I think it's a great summation of honestly a great man, and it's a great loss to the technology community. But celebrating his life and helping people understand who he was is probably the greatest way to memorialize someone who had such a huge impact on what we do.